But she also apparently owns a home here in Philippi on the western side, the Grecian side of the Aegean Sea. So she's got a beach house. That's essentially what this home in Philippi is. It's her beach house. So she lives in Thyatira, but she's got another place in Philippi. These are two leading cities in the ancient world. These are two places where sort of high-end people would traverse. And so she probably moves in some pretty important and influential circles. And it appears to us that no sooner is she converted and her household is baptized, which I hope we can talk about here in a moment, but she immediately begins to try to use her giftings from the Lord for the sake of the missionary team. All right, so no sooner is she converted to Christ, but she begins to use what she has, her training, her experience, even her wealth, for the good of the team. And we know that for two different ways. First, in verse 15, it says that she wants the missionaries to come to stay at her house. And it says she prevailed upon us. So that's almost like the language of salesmanship there, because she's probably a saleswoman herself. And now she's using those persuasive powers to invite the missionary team to stay with her so that she can resource them, she can house them temporarily if necessary. And interestingly, in the same chapter, what we're going to read is that Paul and Silas end up in prison in the city of Philippi. Great story here, but skipping to the end of their time in prison, as soon as they get out of prison in verse 40, the end of the chapter 16, it says, so they went out of the prison and visited Lydia, and when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. So they began to be able to trust and depend on Lydia's gift of hospitality. And that sort of becomes one of the lessons that we see from her life, is that her wealth, her salesmanship, her assets, and she begins to use them immediately for the sake of the Lord, so that she helps provide hospitality to Paul's missionary adventures. Pretty cool.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Now, so Matt, in this chapter, you write that in every generation, people like to look and feel attractive. Now, this reminds me of Pastor Paul Bamel's talk in season 2, Preparing for Worship, where he talks about our attire when we're going before the presence of God. Now, we all like to dress well. I actually don't really care about dressing well, but I have to, given the fact that I'm in a significant role in my church. But anyway, how do you think Lydia was seen when it came to her business? Like, how do you think she dressed?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess I would simply say this. I don't think that there's anything wrong with her having a role in the fashion industry. I think that the Lord uses people in various strata of life. And sure, there are some professions that are, they're not godly. But I don't think there's anything wrong with Lydia making her living or her wealth by way of fashion. People need to be clothed. And even people in the higher echelons of life need to have clothing that's symbolic and appropriate to occasions. So, I would say what the Lord uses is people in every area of life. There ought to be Christian lawyers, and there ought to be Christian doctors, and there ought to be Christian actors, and there ought to be Christian salesmen, and there ought to be Christians who, are garbage men, and Christians who are teachers, Christians who work in factories. I mean, I guess the point is that whatever industry you're in, you should begin to think of yourself as the missionary to that particular work setting. So Lydia has some opportunities here because she apparently travels internationally. She's got various places, and she has a high demand product that only increases her potential to share the gospel with those influential people.
Perfect. And I like how you said that, whatever profession we in should be done to glorify God, which leads to the next question. So Lydia owned multiple homes. You mentioned that, earlier, that she possibly owned a beach home. So with her wealth, if you will, how did she use her material possession to glorify God? And we already know the answer to that one.
Yeah, I mean, just again, I think what we see in Lydia is that her desire was to immediately align her assets, her skills and training with the kingdom of God. And the most immediate way that she could do that is through supporting the Apostle Paul in his missionary ventures. And I think this is a good place to say, Brandon, that, sometimes with the theme of the book Unknown, the whole idea is that anybody can live a significant life for the glory of God, no matter where he has you in your life at this particular moment, right? So Lydia immediately begins to serve him with whatever she has, and I think that's a glorious thing. Sometimes we have this false impression that you have to be a missionary or you have to be a pastor to be somebody who's significant. And if you are a missionary or a pastor, you have to have a highly successful and impacting ministry known by thousands. But that's just not true. No matter where you are in life, God can and will use you. And I tell two stories in the book Unknown in this chapter about some highly influential people that I know that God has used greatly for his kingdom. And they're not missionaries or pastors, but one of them is a lawyer who is one of the most successful lawyers I know. He's an absolute bulldog in the courtroom. I would never want to face him off in a legal situation because he's just such an intimidating presence. But this guy loves Jesus. He uses his legal skills often to defend churches and in courts from time to time when Christians are sued or churches are maligned. He defends them in court. He goes on missions trips. He's built water wells in Mexico and served in orphanages in El Salvador. And I'm just so impressed. I mean, here's this guy who travels amongst some very influential circles of people. And yet he uses what he's been given by God, this incredible legal training, to help the local church. And I just think that's entirely commendable.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Having a lawyer, number one, that knows the legal side, go to bat for Jesus, if you will. I love that. That's just a beautiful thing.
Sure.
Now,
yeah.
In this chapter, you point out that Lydia was never installed as an elder in the church in that time frame.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what that looked like back then. And however, she didn't have a position, if you will, yet she still pursued the work of the church for the saving of God's people. Why do you think a title did not matter to Lydia, and why she's not, I guess it's not a matter to us. It shouldn't be a matter to us today.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I think that's an important one because, first of all, let's admit that in the New Testament there are titles. There are several titles. There's titles like deacon and elder, which is translated from the word presbyter in the original Greek. There's the word episkopos or bishop, which in our tradition we take an episkopos to be the same thing as a presbyter, essentially an elder of a church. We have titles like pastor or pastor teacher, as the New Testament describes it. But here's the thing, Brandon, and I think this is really important to know, is that titles in the New Testament offices, they're not ranks, but they are roles. And there's a difference between a rank and a role. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with ranks either. The military has ranks, and we need to have them because in a battle situation, you need to know who's in charge, and somebody else has to tell everybody else, where to shoot and when to run and when to retreat. There are other roles in society in which ranks can be important, but the New Testament church is not one of those places where ranks really comes into consideration. So we don't think of the pastor as being higher or better in any way than the other elders on the session, nor do we think of the elders as a higher rank than the deacons of the church. And so we don't think of it that way. And so if you think of those kind of terms from the New Testament as being like vertical ranks on a ladder system, then we've got kind of the idea backwards. We don't have ranks in terms of priority, but we do have roles. And the role of the ordained offices, elder and deacon, have to do with what our official function is in the church. So the pastor teacher is the one who pastors and teaches, and elders are the ones who exercise oversight over the flock, and the deacons are those who serve the poor and the needy. Those are roles, and that's why the church has used the word offices from time to time. We talk of elder and deacon as being offices in the church because they have to do with what our function is in relation to the rest of the body. But if we think of those functions as ranks to which we can be promoted or demoted, then we're probably on the wrong track.
That's a very good point. I like that. Now, let's address the fact that Lydia was never portrayed as a woman that was married. Which of the given theories, if you will, do you think that is most likely to be true about Lydia? Was she single? Was she a mother?
Mm-hmm.
Was she widowed? Was she married, divorced? And why?
Great question. Well, let's do what we know. Let's discuss what we know here about Lydia. Unfortunately, Lydia, like so many other characters in the Bible, sometimes presents more questions than we have answers for. And so there's a lot that we would like to know about her personal life because she's such a riveting character to study. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us anything about her being married or divorced or single. It doesn't use any of those words to describe her. But the one thing that we do know in verse 15 of chapter 16 is that she has a household, because it says, after she was baptized, and her household as well, she urged us, saying. And so what that means, the word household in the Greek New Testament usually would include children and then perhaps any household servants as well. So the first and most natural connotation to this word is that she had some children, and probably some servants that worked alongside with her. Now, if she has children from this word household here, one thing that's interestingly not there is any mention whatsoever of a husband. And then that opens up another set of questions for us. If it's true that she has children, is she a single mother? Was she a widow and her husband died? Was she divorced? Was she never married? We honestly just don't know. But the reason why at least one of those situations must be correct is because Lydia apparently makes the decision to have the household baptized. Now, again, household meaning children and possibly servants as well. Usually the person that would make that decision is the head of household. So, for instance, later in the same chapter, we're going to see the Philippian jailer get converted. He turns to Christ and is saved, and he too has his household baptized. But that's a natural decision. Being the father, the head of the household, he could make that decision for his family. But here it seems a bit odd that Lydia would be able to make that decision without any mention of a husband. And so that leads me to just guess that she's probably a single mom, although I wouldn't be able to know whether she's divorced, never married, or perhaps widowed. I think any of those are actually possible from the text.
Awesome. Yeah, the Bible doesn't tell us that, and I look at it as, well, God didn't want us to know, and it wasn't essential to our salvation. So,
yeah, but here's the payoff for this, Brandon, and this is cool, is that she then becomes, for all of our women listeners who are listening into the podcast today, she becomes rather a good example of a single mom, however it is that she found herself in a place of singleness, as one who is leading her household spiritually. And so we can commend her for that, that she has a desire for her children to know the Lord, her employees to know the Lord, her servants or whatever they are. But clearly, she has a household of people that are now following after her. She's the first one to have her heart open to the Lord in verse 14. But now that influence, that Christian influence, is immediately spilled over into the family so that the children and the servants, the employees, they're going to be discipled in the Christian faith as well. And so I just wanted to add a word of encouragement, if I could, for a minute, Brandon. I know my church is like a lot of churches where we have some moms who are the spiritual leaders of their family. And for whatever reason, maybe dad isn't around anymore. Maybe dad is disobedient in the faith. maybe dad didn't do what was right and marry the girl